Hello and welcome to Transfermarkt. My name is Matt and I'm joined by Stefan Bienkowski to talk about the market value downgrade that Antony has experienced yet again. It's his seventh consecutive market downgrade in the latest Premier League update, and the numbers do not make good reading for Antony or for Manchester United fans. Since the 1st of January 2023, Antony's market value was at €75 million, and since then he's experienced the biggest downgrade of any player in the world, losing €55 million in his value. Stefan, it's not gone well for Antony at Manchester United, but you have a few more numbers behind the market value downgrade you want to share.
Yeah, so since the start of 2024, his market value has fallen by 43%. And what's quite telling is when you put together the top 10 of players who've lost the most market value by percentage, I think he finishes 8th, but it's also worth bearing in mind that he's the only player under the age of 25 on that list. So we're talking about a kind of area of our market values, which is usually exclusively reserved for obviously older players who are over 30. There's a few players who've had really unfortunate long-term injuries, like Sasa Kalajic, the striker, Kieran Tierney, obviously the defender at Arsenal, who've unfortunately just kind of had almost career-defining injuries, which have obviously brought their market values down. But Antony kind of stands alone as a young player, presumably in the prime of his life, playing for a big club, but it just hasn't really worked for him. And as a result, we've seen his market value drop from €75 million down to €20 million, and more or less where he was before he kind of really hit the scene at Ajax. And it's unfortunate, and it's almost like a cautionary tale, isn't it? That this is what really happens when a player moves to a big club and things don't really work out.
Yeah, and it's actually 4 years to the month since he had a market value update that was lower than what he has now. So it was in October 2020, he was upgraded to 18 million, and now at 20, it's the lowest he's had since then. But we want to take a look at why it hasn't worked out for him at Manchester United, and just looking at some of the numbers over the last couple of seasons. He had 3 goals last season. He scored against Burnley in the Premier League, and then in the Cup against Newport and Liverpool. One of the numbers that struck me the most was since April of 2023, which is 18 months ago, he has just 2 assists for Manchester United. Now, one of those was a remarkable cross with the outside of his left boot for Alejandro Garnacho in that incredible 4-3 defeat at Stamford Bridge last year. But for a winger who, it's important to mention, has played the majority of games for Manchester United, he is, well, up until the start of this season, was a very, very common feature in that Man United 11. Only 2 assists really is an incredibly disappointing return. And there's, of course, it's not just one reason behind his game that's preventing him from putting these numbers up. You know, he's a heavily one-footed player, which for a modern-day winger isn't something that's ever going to work to your advantage. Defenders know what he's going to do when he gets on the ball. He wants to get that back in his left foot. If you double up with your winger, or if you bring a midfielder in just to guard that space that he wants to cut into, you're effectively nullifying anything he can do when he's forced back to the right back, or forced to play the ball back to one of those defensive midfielders. And I think it's sometimes construed as his decision making just isn't very good. But it's only because there's really only one decision that he can make. It's cut inside and maybe clip the ball into the back post, or have a shot at goal. And like I said, for a modern day winger, that's just not something that's ever going to work out for you. Is there anything else behind his game, or even with Man United as a whole, Stefan, that you think is preventing him from hitting the heights he reached at Ajax?
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a really good job of summarising the difficulties he's had in the Premier League. And, you know, let's be honest, unless you're someone like Arjen Robben or Lionel Messi, then that kind of one-trick pony, not to say that those 2 players were specifically one-trick ponies, certainly not Lionel Messi, but Arjen Robben was the kind of famous one who obviously everyone knew what he was going to do, but you just couldn't stop him doing it. And I guess the issue is that Antony just isn't Arjen Robben. And as you said, loves to cut inside on that left foot. And he is and always has been kind of predominantly a goal scorer. If you kind of look at his stats for Ajax in the Eredivisie, and you kind of look at those league assists, in both those kind of really big breakthrough seasons, he never actually got more than 10 assists over the course of league campaigns. So we're not talking about a winger here who can run down the wing and swing in crosses, and can rely on those crosses, and can rely on that service if he isn't getting into the box. He's a player, he's more of an inside forward, and as you said, if you block off that route to goal, he becomes a very limited player. And I think that's largely what has happened at Manchester United. I think there are a few caveats we have to put in here, just because at Man United, we have seen numerous players time after time after time in those forward positions fail. You know, obviously Jadon Sancho is another one from this year as well, who's left on loan as well to Chelsea. And he's having quite some success at Chelsea there. But it's a similar sort of thing, I think, where for one reason or another, Man United have always had these systems where the wingers are really kind of quite isolated. They're tasked with being match winners. They're tasked with doing things on their own. Whereas if you consider a club like Manchester City, like they move their wingers in and out of the team, but you never really imagine a situation where a Man City winger's been tasked with breaking on his own and being without another player within 20 yards of him. Never mind Man United, whereas routinely, even now, you still see guys like Garnacho who are more or less running down the wing on their own. They're in the opposing half on their own at times, tasked with kind of doing something magical. And I think this has been a problem of Ten Hag's system for a long time. He loves to play that front three, and he tasks those wingers with being these kind of superhuman match winners. And as you said, once teams figured out how Antony did what he did, he struggled with that. And I think the other caveat we have to mention as well is just the way that he came to this club. I thought there was a really interesting report from The Athletic a couple of years ago that said that even before Ten Hag joined the club, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's scouting team scouted Antony at Man United, and they valued him at around 30 million euros at the time, which is actually more or less in line with what we had him valued at on Transfermarkt. And then, of course, Ten Hag comes in, he makes a demand that he wants this player, and it starts this kind of bizarre bidding war where it goes to, Manchester United go from saying we're not willing to pay more than, 55 million euros to eventually having to pay 95 million euros. And it's a deal that could have went up to 100 million if the add-ons had been included, which obviously look unlikely to be the case. And I just kind of wonder if there's another scenario in another timeline, if you will, where Ten Hag doesn't become the Man United manager, someone else comes in, but the club still say, hey, look, there's this decent winger at Ajax, he's 20 years old, he can do some tricks, he's got a lot of raw potential, and we can pick him up for 30 million euros and just kind of keep him in and out of the squad, develop him as a young player, and see what happens. And I think in that scenario, Man United fans he doesn't join the club as like the second most viable player or signing ever. He doesn't join the club as Ten Hag's kind of hero and the guy who will implement Ten Hag's success at the club. And instead, he just comes as another young player who wasn't signed for a huge amount of money, that didn't break the bank, and can kind of drift in and out of the squad as he's developing. A bit, I guess, like Garnacho is now, really, where Man United fans are really willing to kind of put up with some of the downsides of his game because he's still so raw. So I do kind of think with Antony, to a large extent, it's almost like a degree of perception and the PR and the media around it all. The fact that Man United decided to make him one of the most expensive signings ever. Only Paul Pogba joined the club for more. And of course, he joined as Ten Hag's main man, his right-hand man, if you will, if you want to kind of make a very literal comparison to where he is on the pitch. And I think from that moment on, he was kind of set to fail because he was never going to be Man United's match winner or key player at that age.
I think it's a very interesting point, and I think there are a lot of footballers that we can look at who are a victim of circumstance when they come in for a very high fee. And for me, the most recent and best example in the Premier League is Brennan Johnson at Tottenham, who everyone talks about that price tag that Spurs played and that Spurs paid rather. And now potentially Johnson's turning it around. But even when we share on our various platforms graphics that show maybe the top 10 signings of all time in terms of fees paid, top 10 in the Premier League, I always find that the main comments are that X, Y amount of these players were flops. And, a big one is always Eden Hazard and that move to Real Madrid, that some fees are just so exorbitantly high that it's difficult for players to live up to that expectation, and they're always judged on the fee rather than the player that they are. And for someone like Antony, who came in at such a young age to Manchester United, they were never paying for the player that they were getting in that moment. They were paying for the player that they thought Antony could become. But because of that fee, he was judged as though he were that player already when he came in. So it's a difficult situation for sure. In terms of what you've seen from him at Manchester United, and again, including that caveat you mentioned there of the system difficulties that wingers could have with United, are there any saving graces you've seen from his game? Because looking at the underlying numbers, his passing isn't great, his dribbling isn't great, his shooting isn't great. His defensive numbers for a winger are actually quite decent. But are there any other saving graces that you think another team might look at him and say, well, we can do something with that?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I think at a certain point in his time at Manchester United, Ten Hag realised that things weren't going to work out for him. He wasn't going to work out, but he wasn't going to be this guy who got into double digits for goals and assists every season in the Premier League. And he was almost kind of still relying on him. So he did kind of almost turn him into this kind of defensive winger. And we've now kind of seen him more or less be kind of ushered out of the team, if you will, especially this season. I think he's only had 2 games or 2 appearances. And he's kind of been replaced by Amad Diallo, Garnacho, and of course other players in that position too, Xerxes, for example. So, I mean, at this moment in time, I don't really foresee any kind of future format Man United. But if another club were looking at him, I think there probably is there's still a player there who I think can still kind of turn things around and get his career back on track. I actually do think he is still a pretty solid dribbler of the ball. I don't think he's the fastest player. I think he does rely on kind of beating his man and then doing something with it rather than, being one of these players that can kind of outrun defenses over the course of 50 or 60 yards. But I think if we go back to what we said at the top of that video, or as you mentioned, the way that teams kind of doubled up on him at Manchester United. Now, that's obviously something that happens at clubs like Man United all the time because they dominate possession. They're expected to kind of take the attacking game or take the game to their opponents. And as a result, fullbacks and wingers kind of double up on the opposing winger. If Antony was to move to another club, perhaps slightly further down the Premier League, a mid-table club, maybe even a team in the bottom half, where these teams are set up to counter-attack, these teams are set up to have defensive wingers who can break and move into space, then I think that's something that Antony could thrive in. And, we have kind of seen him linked to a number of clubs. Obviously, already, I think Newcastle and Crystal Palace are the ones that have been linked so far. The Newcastle one intrigues me. I'm not entirely sure if I'd buy that one, but the Crystal Palace one I think is really interesting because obviously they lost Michael Olise to Bayern Munich in the summer. And I'm certainly not saying that Antony's the kind of guy who can step into Michael Olise's shoes straight away, but I think he is a player that could be very useful for a team who play counter-attacking football or at least have more space to run into and at least don't have the expectation where the opposition double up on your wingers every week. I'd be really intrigued to see how Antony does in that kind of situation.
And it could be the boost that Crystal Palace need as well with their difficult start to the season. Some fresh blood in there in January could definitely prove very valuable for them. And you mentioned a few of the players that Antony is competing with at Manchester United, and it's the fact that he's low down in that pecking order now that United could be willing to let him go, whether it's on a permanent deal or on loan in January. He's played just 27 minutes in the Premier League this season, and he's behind, I think, fairly clearly Amad Diallo, Alejandro Garnacho and Marcus Rashford in that pecking order. You mentioned Joshua Zirkzee as well, who could maybe play not as a typical winger, but as an inside forward or as a kind of wide attacking midfielder. And if Mason Mount can keep his fitness, it's not uncommon for Bruno Fernandes to move out into those wide positions either. So I think with every game that passes, almost Antony is just moving further and further away from a starting position in that United team. And as you mentioned, there's been links there to Newcastle and Palace over the summer. There was links even to teams outside of the Premier League and outside of the top 5 leagues for Antony as well. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. If there is a new manager to come into Man United, maybe there's a chance there at a reset for him and maybe have 6 months to prove himself that he's good enough to stay in that team. But let's wait and see what happens. Things change very, very quickly in football, and just as quickly as things turn sour for Antony, it could very, very definitely turn around when you have a player who has the numbers that he had at Ajax particularly, and who has shown incredible flashes of quality at Man United. I mentioned that assist for Garnacho in that game against Chelsea last season. There's no doubt there's quality in there. It's just about finding a manager or a system or a club who can extract that from him on a more consistent basis, and I'm sure the numbers will start to come as well. But look, let us know in the comments below what you think about Antony and the way things have gone from United. Where do you see his future as well, and do you see him turning around the decline? Like I've said, 7 consecutive market value downgrades for him. If you are new to the channel as well, if you haven't hit that subscribe button down below, do make sure to do so for more of these videos and much more content in the coming weeks and months. But for now, for myself and Stefan, as always, thanks for watching.